All right, and we are live. I am here with Jai Jagannath, Deva Madhava, and Kishore Chandra, and this is the second episode of Arise, the Honest Man's podcast. And today we're going to be getting into a pretty sticky topic, I think, for a lot of people that is not very often spoken about. But first, we want to say what this is about. In essence, it's about real men arising to end the silence around us about the chains that bind us, to dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies, to finally become the hero within us all.
It sounds so epic when you say that. Yeah, let's get into the honest discussion. What I like to say also, the price for honesty is fearlessness. So let's see how much currency we're packing today. So the subject matter we want to get into today is guilt and shame. And this is kind of a follow-up to our last week's episode. So in last week's episode, just a quick recap, we were talking about sexual addiction. And amongst the different types of sexual addictions we brought up, we specifically zoomed in on PMO, which means porn, masturbation, orgasm, as particularly insidious and corrupting. And we gave our various reasons why we dealt with a sort of objection to that and why we didn't agree with the objection. And then we kind of gave a definition. We gave our own personal experiences with it, which was a particularly vulnerable moment of the show, which I thought went very nice. And then after that, we gave a definition of sexual addiction as avoidance. The real problem isn't lust, but the real problem is avoidance. There's something within us that we're not facing, we're not confronting, we're not overcoming. Beautiful definition from this book, Sacred Sexuality by George Forrestein. How do you say it?
Jai Jagannath, I'm gonna tell you this one more time, right? Okay, goes like this: Feuerstein.
That's right. Right. Forrestein. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, you got it.
And then we answered the question, am I a bad yogi if I like porn? Jamuna and Kishore answered that question beautifully. And so I wanted to bring this up, that there were a lot of suggestions in the comments about solutions to the problem. We weren't so much zooming in on solutions to the problem in the conversation because we wanted to more paint a realistic picture of the inner landscape of the modern man today. It's easy to just like shoot out some, especially for bhaktas or practitioners of yoga or self-help or spirituality or life coaches. It's very easy to shoot out, you do this is the solution. But without actually getting maybe a deeper insight to the inner landscape of what the modern man is going through, those solutions may or may not be fully understandable or able to be integrated for those who are struggling with this thing. So in the spirit of still mapping out that inner landscape, we wanted to talk about why this remains a largely silent killer, especially in religious and spiritual communities. And we've pinpointed guilt and shame as the culprits who kind of disguise themselves in our hearts in very effective ways, or maybe they're not so disguised in some ways. And it keeps us silent about the issues, even to ourselves to a large degree. So we kind of want to get into that subject matter and maybe get into some ways of how we might let go of guilt and shame. You ever felt guilt and shame around sex and sexuality? You ever feeling guilt? Okay, so let's start with a definition of guilt. We want to talk about guilt first and then shame after, because there's a distinction between the two. And we're taking inspiration again from this book from George Bowerstein.
Jai, you know what happens? You know what happens when you enter into a big building? There's this room that you enter into first, and it's called a foyer.
Bowerstein. Okay.
Yeah.
We're taking inspiration from how he addresses the subject matter in his opening statements of the book. So basically, guilt is defined as the painful awareness of doing something wrong. There was some transgression, there was some impropriety, you became aware of that, and you feel some pain inside, basically. This is a general definition of guilt. He divides his guilt into two broad categories: situational guilt and what he calls modal guilt. Situational guilt means there's a situation where there is an impropriety. You became aware of that, you feel guilty. That's natural, that's human, that's warranted. But then he speaks about something that he calls as modal guilt, which is basically you've done something, you've violated something that was like absolutely not supposed to be violated, like an inviolable law or like a sin. So even after repenting for it by apologizing, maybe by what do you call this?
Flagellation.
By self-flagellation, even after you do some form of penance for that impropriety, it's still on you, like the bad scent of, let's say, like Hing. After you cleaned out the bottle, you can clean out the bottle of Hing as much as you want. That scent is there. So when you have modal guilt or modal guilt, like mode of nature, modal guilt, then it kind of sticks with you like this bad scent in your own psychology, and you're carrying around that weight in your mind all the time, which kind of arrests creative energy, it arrests confidence, it arrests self-esteem. It kind of brings you toward the direction of shame, which we'll get to in a minute. So this is the general definition of guilt, which I thought was a very good definition, a very good sort of categorization. Would you guys agree with this sort of definition? Is it making sense? If there's anyone wants to flesh this out a little bit, please flesh it out. I guess I want to get to, now we can feel guilty about a lot of things. Like, one thing I feel guilty about, genuinely, I'm not gonna even lie about this, is like passing air. Especially like if you like rip a hard one. Like I feel extremely guilty about that, like embarrassed. And that's more like situational guilt. I don't carry it around as a modal guilt, but I do feel guilty about. So there are tons of things we probably feel guilty about that aren't very serious. But when it comes to sex and sexuality, that guilt tends to be a lot more profound. And so I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts about these definitions, and particularly first memories that you have that you can think of where you experience situational and or modal guilt in relationship to sex and sexuality. This is the kickoff question.
Also, I just want to make a very small little addition there, is that Feuerstein also points out that that the worry or a feeling of guilt can manifest even without a person having committed a wrongful act. Like the mere intention to do something, or the mere desire to do something which is out of alignment with your values and with your moral standards, can basically incite a very, very strongly afflicted state of being of constant modal guilt. So that's also something. We may not even have to have done anything. Just wanting to is sometimes enough.
Thank you for bringing it up. Like if you have like a freaky thought, you carry around the modal guilt for the rest of the day. What's wrong with me? All right. So yeah, let's see it. Who wants to go first?
When you were sharing before we started talking, and you were mentioning you'd be asking for these kind of stories, like one just immediately came to mind, and it sat with me ever since I was like 8 years old, but it's been deeply felt since then. We were going to a family wedding, and it was seeing people basically I'd never seen in my life, but their family, and so okay. And I remember my cousin, who was like probably 15 years older than me, maybe, and she had a big chest, and she was in a bridesmaid's gown, and I was 8 years old, and I just couldn't stop looking at the chest of my cousin, and I felt so bad, even though whatever. And a few days after we got back from that wedding, I was just like sobbing, and I went to see my dad. And I like confessed to him. I said, you know, he was like, Devin, what's wrong? Like, he thought something was really off. And I blurted it out in like this choked, sobbing voice. And he just like, he rolled his eyes. He had no idea what to say to me. And he just said, it's fine. And kind of ignored it. And that didn't really help. That he didn't acknowledge it so much. And since then, it's always been like that. I feel that a lot. Anytime I have that attraction, it takes me back to that 8-year-old moment. And,
Wow.
you know, cousin or not cousin, there's just like this deep sense of shame around it.
Wow.
That
sounds like a moto guilt sort of thing.
Say again?
That moto guilt, is it? That's what
yeah. I mean, I suppose so. It's lifelong. I can still feel the feeling today, like that shame, that wrongness, that awkwardness. I still feel it.
Right.
I can totally relate to that. I remember, I think I was maybe 12, 13, and for a very brief period of time, I was dating this girl in my primary school, you know, because I mean, what is like primary school dating even, you know? And I'll tell you what it is. We went ice skating, and I just remember very distinctly having exactly the same experience, Deva, of just not, because she was 13 years old, but she was like particularly well endowed for a 13-year-old, you know. And I just also remember just being utterly transfixed by what was going on her chest. And I remember, like, in the car on the way back from our ice skating date, having this, like, still not being able to, like, divert my attention, and then having this realization that, like, I am actually not into this for any other reason than basically, like, drooling over this person, you know. Like, that was that. And I didn't articulate it quite like that, but, you know, that was pretty much the feeling. But then but I wouldn't say that was all that guilty, because also, as time went along, now I had a very, very peculiar situation growing up in terms of moral instruction, because my father, on the one hand, when it came to things like smoking, drinking, partying, you know, like being debaucherous in general in those ways, he was like super strict and super against it. But when it came to sex, he told me, you should have as much sex as you possibly can. Because one day, when you're old like me, then you're going to think about all those times that you could have and you didn't. You know? And, like, I basically grew up with that as my moral standard when it came to sexuality. Now, luckily, I still had somewhat of an intuitive understanding that wasn't a good idea, because, you know, my mother was very much not in that mood. But I could have easily, I think, used that just as an excuse to just, like, indulge as much as I possibly can. But still, you know, sex and everything related to sexuality wasn't something that I felt any reason to feel too guilty about, other than, you know, when we were perhaps on holiday with family members, and, you know, there may have been a cousin or two that was also particularly well endowed, and I find myself kind of taking a peek, you know, then it's like, okay, you know, you don't cross the bloodline standard, you know, that's just taking the bit too far.
Oh my God.
Incest is not best. It's not. So I only really started to experience, like, true guilt when you know, I entered into a spiritual philosophy that has very highly developed moral standards. But anyway, we'll get to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I was going to interject before you go, Kishore Chandra. So this is very interesting because now we have a couple of other devotees here who aren't on the straight and narrow path, if you know what I mean. So our experience with guilt will be a little bit different, right?
Mm.
All right, Kishore, you go.
Yeah.
First experiences or memories.
I would say it was so interesting to hear Karuna Avatar say like, yeah, I didn't really start experiencing guilt, like real guilt, until like I got into a spiritual path that was like had morals. When I heard him say that, I was just like, wow. Like for me, because I'm not on the straight and narrow path and I'm like an openly gay person, guilt and shame have simply just been like a part of my life since the earliest I can possibly remember. And it has definitely had like detrimental effects on my ability. I think the definition of guilt at the beginning was saying something along the lines of like the ability to have confidence and interpersonal relationships and things like that. It has definitely had detrimental effects on it, because not only, as a normal boy, like 12 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, like thoughts were coming into my head, like sexual thoughts were coming into my head, but they were towards the same sex. And so I personally was raised in a very traditional Hispanic household, and not only were we Christian, but we were Jehovah's Witnesses. And so it was a lot. And I think that when it comes to guilt and shame, I remember I couldn't even speak to anyone about these kinds of feelings or thoughts that I was having. I couldn't speak to my family. I couldn't speak to anyone in the religious community. And on top of that, I couldn't even speak to my like friends in school, because at that time it wasn't, like how it is now, where everything's kind of a free for all. And it's like, I mean, what I've heard from the kids, like my nephews and stuff, is like gender fluidity and all this stuff is like normal nowadays. In school, I'm saying, like when you're 12, like that kind of thing. So I couldn't speak to anyone really about it. So it became a very isolating experience. And I just wanted to share something that I thought was very interesting, and maybe some people can relate to this, is that I think when it comes to morality and these feelings of guilt and shame, because guilt, like the definition was saying, it's like, okay, I feel bad because I've done something wrong, or I've done something outside of the moral, kind of the morals that I follow. But I feel like when guilt becomes a prominent feature in one's life, or you feel guilt a lot, you become very hyper aware, or like hyper vigilant of like what's wrong and what's not wrong. And I feel like this can be a good thing in some ways, but I also feel like it can be kind of like a not so good thing, because my experience with being like hyper aware or hyper vigilant is that when things inevitably like don't go my way, or I step out of line, or I do something wrong or whatever, the slide from guilt to shame is very fast. Like it just goes like, because I've been hyper aware and hyper vigilant of like, this is how it's supposed to be and this is how it's not supposed to be. So I'm trying my best to be on the how it's supposed to be lane. And if something goes awry, it's just like, like this. And I feel like, we'll get into this when we start talking about shame and these kinds of things. But I feel like these feelings of guilt and shame, when not properly addressed, like David was saying, like his dad was just like not wanting to talk about it. Also, I remember, I think my parents gave me the sex talk, or my dad gave me the sex talk like once. And it was very just like we're not talking about this. It was like a 5-minute thing of just like, here's a condom and this is how you use it, and that's about it.
5-minute tutorial.
Yeah, like that. And I feel like when you don't talk about these things, one can, it becomes very detrimental to like one's own development in life. So I'm so happy that we have this space to talk about it.
My experience is like y'all's in some ways, but also maybe a little unique. My first experience is with guilt surrounding sex and sexuality is that before, I was a really good artist at one point. Like good, I could draw. I was like a really good drawer. Drawer, is that how you say that? From the time I was like 5 till about 11 or 12, I used to draw a lot. And I was quite good at it. And I remember, hitting puberty and starting to become aware of different physiological changes in the body and a sort of attraction. I remember my first memories of drawing some pictures, and we're just gonna leave it like that. And there were pictures they were largely pictures of women at the time. And I remember drawing, they were like hypersexual and, basically nudes. And I did the best. I was rigorous in trying to hide them. But somehow or other, by providential arrangement, the moms know. So my mom discovered the pictures. And I remember like she's like, Yeshua, that's my legal name. She was like, can we talk? And I was like, and that was part of my first experience, kind of like feeling guilt, like I have done something wrong, even though there weren't any like specific rules that I was aware of or any like specific necessary like moral standard that I was aware of. But there was a sense that I had like crossed the line. And my mom was like super cool about it. She actually was like hyper vigilant, not to create a situation where I would feel shame around that at all. And she was largely encouraging. And to be honest with you, my mother, I feel like the earliest memories I have of her talking about sex was like 7. And being like kind of very open about it. Obviously not being very graphic, but kind of just being like very open about it to make sure that it wasn't something that we should feel embarrassed about or feel ashamed of. So even though it was like a situation where I felt guilt, it was like limited to situational guilt because my mom was so cool about it. And she was so like vigilant to make sure that it didn't translate into something that I was just carrying deeply in the heart. That was kind of my first experience with that. Of course, she's a lady, and there's some limitations of what she can tell you about what you're going through as a man. And so that became like a barrier between, as I started getting a little bit older and started noticing other sorts of psychological shifts in my mind. It became basically impossible for me to talk to her about any of these things whatsoever. And so then this is toward the end of middle school, and in high school, I become a dancer. And just as a sidebar, I wouldn't want to take birth again just so I can avoid middle school. Like kids are demonic, dude. They're like straight up demonic. If they were killed, no, I'm kidding. I'm not gonna go that far. This is the internet. You gotta be careful what you say. But middle school was very heavy, and I did the whole dancer thing. So people started like cracking all sorts of jokes about, sexuality, like the faggot jokes, the gay jokes, this, that, and other. And this was before I was coming to discover anything different about myself. That people were coming like hard. And so that time you start to internalize like this is something you should feel bad about. But because I had this strong mother figure at the home who was like very vigilant that I wouldn't feel bad about anything surrounding sex and sexuality, I kind of never got to the point where you felt ashamed about really anything related to sex or sexuality. But it became very apparent that in the social context of what I was participating in, like there are certain things that are right, there are certain things that are wrong, and you should feel guilty or that you've committed a deep sin if you do these sorts of activities. And so that was kind of like probably my first experience with like a sort of modal guilt where you've not even done anything. I'm like, even to this day, I'm like, I'm a little pure in terms of actual engagement, but that so-called purity is probably related to guilt and shame. Anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. So I wasn't doing anything, but there was still this sort of sense inside that you're like carrying around this sin. It's just like with you wherever you go. People can notice it as soon as they see it, and they crack jokes about it because they're evil and they have no compassion. And you kind of start to internalize that thing. And I think that was the first shift in high school where situational guilt, where feelings around sex and sexuality, which were limited to situational guilt, became imbibed as modal guilt because of the culture that I was growing up in. Of course, by that time, there was like, anyway, maybe we can get into this in the next question, but basically I was going to say by that time, like this is like early 2000s, like 2000, 2001, there was like, obviously, I'm sure you'll be aware of this, like an LGBT agenda. And I don't necessarily mean that in a conspiratorial sense. Obviously, I mean that in a conspiratorial sense for anyone who knows me personally. But I just mean it also in that, like, the visible sense that there was like an LGBT agenda. Like there were a lot more shows coming up where they were like featuring LGBT characters. They were featuring, I remember there was this one show, I didn't see it at the time, but there was one show, Queer as Folk, I think. There was like, it was clear that it was an agenda. Like they were really pushing for more of acceptance of this sort of landscape of sex and sexuality, so that you never had to like spiral down into shame exactly, but there's still this sort of internalized feeling that this was like demonic. And, or if not demonic, it was wrong, it was a sin, you got, this was something. So it was kind of like first experiences with that. So interesting story, because I had a mother who was like super cool about it, but then a culture that was very different. And so how it escalated. All right, so that's guilt. Let's get into shame. Now, the way Feuerstein, thank you, I got it. The way Feuerstein discusses shame is the difference between, so guilt is the painful feeling that comes from awareness of something that you've done wrong. Shame, he says, is distinct in that it's a painful feeling from being unworthy. So in the one case, there's like a transgression of, it's a problem of doing, a failure of doing. I didn't do right. But in the second case, it's a failure of being. I am unworthy because of, X, Y, Z. I really found that to be kind of very nice distinction, and makes it very clear some sort of emotional landscape going on internally. So yeah, I kind of wanted to ask that question. Do you have any first memories with shame, where you felt like you were unworthy to be loved, unworthy to be accepted, unworthy to belong, because of, especially connected to sex and sexuality?
Well, firstly, just a very brief addition is, I just really liked how this was put, is that guilt is essentially related to transgression, where shame is related to inadequacy, being fundamentally lacking. So I just like those two words. And
nice.
I mean, shame, definite manifestation of shame in childhood years and in teenage years, of basically, I was told as a kid, and I'll get into the realm of sexuality, but just very briefly, as a kid, I was told, there was this mantra that was repeated to me, that I just want you to reach your full potential. All you have to do is reach your full potential, right? What the hell is that supposed to mean to a child? That means you have to be perfect in everything that you do, and if you're not, then basically you're not good enough. And so I would definitely say that, like, I had a constant, I think, but it was like an unarticulated feeling of shame that settled deeply into my inner being, and just basically festered in just constantly feeling like I wasn't good enough, and that anything that I tried to do, I just wouldn't be able to do it as well as I should. So I think that it initially definitely manifested in that regard. And then, it's like, as we discussed last week, PMO, porn, masturbation, and orgasm, is these days basically like staple sustenance for young men growing up. And so when I initially entered into the ashram, then I kind of like, I went cold turkey on the porn, but masturbation wasn't so easy, at least initially. And there was kind of like there were moments where I would kind of, very sneakily do my thing, and then feel really, really, really rotten about that. And then sort of like, as I matured in my spiritual life, and came to, more deeply understand our philosophy and our exact conceptions of how things are meant to be and not to be, and what we're meant to be desiring and not desiring, then shame it settles in, settles in deeply. Yeah, so I'll just open up with that, and I mean it can become more specific, but
it seems like for you, and probably I imagine for a lot of us, men in the world, that shame became more pronounced after you became a devotee and not before, just from what I'm hearing, particularly when it comes to sex and sexuality, which is very interesting. That's what we want to discuss after these anecdotes, so to speak.
I was kind of a counter to that. I had an opposite experience. Not that I didn't struggle with my sexuality after meeting the devotees, but I was so relieved that there was a philosophical basis for the struggle. And the struggle no longer had this existential element of like, is this who I am? Is this very like perverse, abusive, manipulative thing that needs to extract from others what I want with disregard for them? To know that that's not who I am was for me a huge relief in entering into Krishna consciousness. The discussion around shame, just what came to my mind right away was that I used to make up sexual encounters just to avoid having to admit that I hadn't had one before, because my own awkwardness and feeling of whatever that kept me from engaging in that way for a very long time, way past kind of the normal threshold in our time, middle school, high school, even into college. I would just make up encounters so that I wouldn't have to tell people that no, I've not done that, and and face the shame of having stayed clean and clear. I would make up having gotten down and dirty somewhere with someone that nobody else knew. Straight and like, what did I tell this person? And it was a whole and so it just brought more anxiety, of course, trying to maintain that. But that's how weird it was, the need to feel like I validated myself in that way in order to keep myself looking some way in the eyes of peers.
Yeah, you have to make sure, right, that the person you got down and dirty with lives far away. You didn't have their number. You didn't have their picture.
I would ask friends, like, you remember when I went to the beach that week or whatever? Yeah, when I went to the beach, and that's and then they're like, oh yeah, that's cool. Wait, and they cheer you on. And I'd say something dismissive like, I don't want to piss where I sleep or something like that, in terms of why I'm not spending time with women in my immediate area. And yeah, it was scary to have to face that.
Wow.
Yeah, Yamuna was saying exactly the same thing last week. He had exactly the same experience, but it didn't go so well for him because he made something up, and then the person that he told it to went to the girl that he spoke about.
Yeah, I never spoke about real girls.
Yeah, that wasn't smart. I remember only one time.
Smart move I made.
I remember one time doing the same thing, David, but I made sure that I made up a story about someone that didn't live in the same state. I didn't have any pictures because we didn't really have proper phones, and I was too broke to own a camera. Yeah. And I had all the bases covered. I knew exactly what I was going to say. It was practically scripted. And then I just repeated it to my friends, and that way I could be seen in a certain way in the eye of my peers. So yeah, Jamona just made a blunder there. It was a little blunder.
I made up for the first year of high school. I made up a girlfriend. And you know what? And you know what? It was a really bad lie, and somehow people really believed me. And I still don't understand to this day how, because it was so bad. I was like, yeah, she's in Long Island, in New Rochelle or something. And New Rochelle, apparently, it's upstate and not Long Island. I don't know. When you grow up in New York City, you don't really pay attention so much to upstate and Long Island. But anyway, in regards to shame, I feel just mentioning the fact that I made up a girlfriend when I was my entire first year of high school. And the reason I did that was because, like, I mean, yeah, I was still brought up in a time when it wasn't seen, like, when being LGBT was not like a good thing. It was like a very bad thing. And on top of that, like, I was raised in a religion where it was like super bad. It was like, you're a demon and you're burning in hell. And I remember like when my mother found out, and it was also one of those things of like divine arrangement, because, you know, I had all my boxes.
Tell the story. This is so funny.
Oh my God, stop. I had all my boxes checked. You know, I had my fake girlfriend. I had all of it. But actually, I had like a high school boyfriend, and while I had the fake girlfriend. And so I remember for Valentine's Day, I had like written him a letter or something like this, a very loving and explicit letter, and and that I made on word art. Some of you might remember word art, Microsoft. And so I printed it on the home computer, and I guess I accidentally like printed 2 copies instead of 1, and I left a copy there. And so my mother finds this copy of the letter to my boyfriend. It was so bad, and I just remember I get a call. I get a phone call. She's like, you know, Kevin, what are you doing? And I'm picking you up from school today. And I was like, okay. And so she picks me up from school, and she's like super grave, super serious. And she shows me the letter, but it was really bad. You know, it was really bad because she was super like personally hurt by it, because like she was just like, this is just flat out wrong. Like, this is just flat out really bad. And then so my experience was that, like, obviously there was a lot of shame around it, because like from a young age, when I was having like sexual attraction towards like people of the same sex in my congregation, which was like, this is terrible, this is so bad. And like, just to paint a picture for all of you, like, you know, for those of you that might not know the Jehovah's Witnesses, like, I had to like dress up in a suit as a child and like go from door to door and like knock on people's door and be like, this is, you know, this is like the message of God, and like, I'm a perfect little saint, and like I had to get up in front of the congregation and speak about God and stuff like this. So even like the idea that like this was popping into my head was just like so bad. So anyway, so then when my mother found out, it was very much like, you're a demon, and like excommunicated from, you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses and like whatever. But my approach to shame was very bad, because it was like, I got to this point where I felt so much shame around just being who I am, you know, having that like material condition on me, that I was just like, you know what, fine. If I'm bad, then let me be bad. And I went for it, to put it, you know, I went for it. And I was just like, if I'm bad, and if all of you are telling me that I'm like a demon and I'm going to go burn in hell, and let me do all the things that I'm supposedly not supposed to do. And maybe we can get into this conversation later, because I went very deeply into like the LGBT whatever world, but I got to a certain point where I was just like, this is terrible. Like, this is awful, you know, like this extreme jump into one direction is very awful. And then my experience coming back to spiritual life, because I actually met the devotees when I was 21 years old, but I didn't start to take devotional life seriously until I was 26, for this specific reason, because I didn't feel like I could talk about this. I didn't feel like I could be open with the devotees about this. And it really was like the mercy of meeting devotees at the Bhakti Center, where it was like a very different understanding and approach to it that kind of helped me be very okay with being open about these kinds of things, and working around the shame around it. And I feel like that's been very important, because I found that, you know, there are certain places like Bhakti Center, and there are certain devotees where it's just like, you can be very open about this kind of stuff and no one's going to shame you around it. But my experience has been that there are other places and other you know, parts of our organization that like, it's definitely not okay to share these kinds of things. And I've had a lot of people reach out to me, and I'm sure Jaya has had many people reach out to him as well, that are like in fear, in shame, not feeling safe to talk about it, you know, faking a relationship with a woman. And I feel like the highest point of that, like the most sad, detrimental point of that is, you know, when people actually go through, I'm speaking about men specifically, where they go through like actually marrying a woman, you know, and they're gay, like they're very gay, and they marry a woman, and it's like so it's so bad, it's so bad for both parties. And I've had people reach out to me with their stories, and I always send them to Jaya. But anyway, I think, yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing because, at least from my perspective, I'll end on this. It's like, I have not stayed as pure as Jaya. um, but my experience has been very similar in that, like, I've gone into that kind of darkness and just seen how dark it can get, and like the answers are, I feel like there's so much emphasis put on like identifying with our sexual propensities, whether that be a straight propensity or whether that be an LGBT propensity. It's like, this is now who I am, and this governs my like every movement. And it's just so, I feel like that actually brings upon more shame when you try to have a life around principles and dignity. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle.
Yeah, we've got this comment that Jasal is saying, like, he's saying young people are bragging, and that's basically what it is. Like, your sense of value as a person is linked to your promiscuity or your sexual prowess in whatever arena. And or in your experience with the Jehovah's, that your fidelity to a certain version of sexuality then is a demonstration of your purity or whatever, your fidelity to the community. And if you aberrate from that, then you're no longer valuable at all to the community. That's the end all be all, make or break of the whole exchange.
Right. And then after that, you just embrace the image of yourself that they imposed upon you, which is it's an interest, like a peculiarity of human nature, that if someone keeps like imposing a certain image of you onto you, then you're kind of like, you know what? Yes. And then you kind of just embrace it. And I feel like, sidebar, like, I think that happens a lot in our political landscape today also, as an example of how two sides, they have a certain vision of each other that they insist upon, that the other person is in fact like this without knowing them. And at a certain point, when someone continues to insist upon that, you just say, you know what? I'm just going to embrace that. Since they're thinking I'm doing this, then I'm going to actually do that. I'm going to actually, quote unquote, be that. So it's, anyway, yeah, you brought up a lot of wonderful, subtle points there. Like I said, because I grew up in a home where my mom was like kind of vigilant that we wouldn't feel embarrassed around sex and sexuality. And I think there might have been a sense of like overcompensating because there wasn't a man in the house. And she knew that we would be going through a lot of things that we probably wouldn't be able to confide in her about. And so she maybe was overcompensating to make sure that we didn't feel ashamed. So there wasn't really any deliberate, I can't remember a conscious feeling of shame where I felt like there was something inadequate about me, or like there was something unworthy about me as a being. But modal guilt and shame are kind of closely linked. And I think obviously there's shame in the sense that you want to dissimulate like that aspect of yourself from the world, particularly when it comes to like LGBT stuff. You want to just dissimulate and, make sure that no one finds out about that because of this. That's clearly shame there. There's some shame, but like on a personal level, like subjectively, I was like, I'm definitely worthy, and someone would be fortunate to be with me. I had that because I was a dancer. Like I had this sort of dancer's ego also. And dancers are, anyway, generally speaking, in my lived experience as a dancer, they're puffed up. They have a certain area to them because, especially classical dancers, because there's a certain elegance about how they carry themselves. And basically pride. So I had that pride aspect. And I also, to be honest with you, I think a lot of the pride aspect that was linked to my ability to do other things also came from shame, in this sense of having to dissimulate. So you have to overcompensate in other areas to show that you are adequate enough. So I never thought about it deeply, but just as I'm thinking out loud right now, I can definitely see that being a factor. Not only was I a dancer, I was also an athlete. I was on the track team, I was on the volleyball team. I did a lot of sports when I was in high school because there's probably a sense of overcompensation, needing to show yourself as more because of that. Dissimulation, on the other hand. But I never felt like on a subjective level that I was less than in any way. But the feeling that you were kind of obliged to dissimulate this aspect was like, okay, that's shame there. And I probably, just to Dave Madova's point, I'm going to transition to this. It took philosophy in order to help me navigate what was happening with me existentially. And like David Madova, I also think I felt a little relief from that because, as you just mentioned, David, quoting whoever you were mentioning, there's this pressure to fuse your identity with your sexuality and make everything about that. And that's just like a lot. It puts a lot of stress on the psyche when you have to do that. And so I think I also experienced relief having entered Christian consciousness to realize, like, oh, I'm not the body, I'm not the psyche, I'm not this physical. So I guess it kind of gives you enough distance to kind of like rewrite your self-image for yourself instead of having to embrace what you kind of were pigeonholed into. But otherwise, yeah, subjectively, I can't remember feeling intense shame aside from the dissimulation part until after becoming a devotee. And that's why I want to switch gears now and talking about guilt and shame in the context of devotional service, or just religious or spirituality in general. Spirituality tends to be sex negative, basically, and a lot of it, like when we were reading Forrest Stein's book, I got it, it's in my head now. When we were reading his book, he was speaking a lot about inheriting like Middle Eastern traditional understandings around sex. But I was thinking, forget Middle Eastern, even Vedanta aspect is pretty sex negative. You know, asana pi klesha da atadeha Rishabh Dev saying the body is klesha da. It is a giver of misery. And sex life specifically is pinpointed as the chain that binds souls to the world of suffering. Like in, for example, Pung Sastriya Me Tumi Bhav. There's so many verses I can quote off the top of my head. So there's a pretty strong sex negative emphasis around sex and sexuality, so that when you enter into the Christian consciousness community, then your guilt and shame around those things become magnified like anything. So I wanted to hear about experiences with that. And I have a lot of ideas around this that I think I'd like to get into a little bit, just because of Christian conscious philosophy. Like, how do we reconcile our Vedanta emphasis, and Vedanta tends to be pretty self-abnegating, with a Bhakti emphasis, which tends to be a little bit more integrating, where it's like, okay, the body isn't all negative. If you use it for devotional service, it's great. It's not really a problem. So I want to get into that conversation, but first I want to hear about this sort of magnification of guilt and shame in the context of entering devotional service. Of course, I'm sorry about you, Kishore. You've been dealing with this your whole life, but for some of us, we experienced the magnification only after joining Christian consciousness. So I want to hear about, like, yeah, what was your experience of that, and how have you navigated that over the years?
I'm not going to begin this time.
It was like, I ran out of fearless currency. I'm sorry, I'm gonna just be quiet now.
I'm on my second marriage, and the first marriage that ended, that was a lot of the awkwardness that I put into the relationship, a lot of the bad that I brought was around my trying to reconcile the reality of a relationship with a person and the standard that the community kind of hides itself behind. And I feel this is my own kind of reflection, that there's such a deep need for the community to feel pure, and the actual demonstration of that purity, which our real measurement is love for God, love for Krishna, is not so evident every day, everywhere, all the time. And so then these external standards become, they're kind of easier benchmarks to make ourselves feel good, that yes, I'm very pure and I'm very close to attaining perfection, etc. And so these standards are emphasized, overemphasized. And in trying myself to feel that kind of confidence in my relationship, that I'm a good devotee, being a good devotee husband for my good devotee wife, I actually spoiled things by not just having a natural exchange of affection, more, in a wholesome way. And it created a lot of all the feelings of guilt and shame that are already present, and especially present for women. I mean, we're guys, we have a different way of dealing with our emotions, but when a woman is feeling an emotion, that's her reality. Guys have an easier time of separating emotion from their reality using rationale. The strength of a woman is also the weakness, in that an emotion just becomes all consuming in many cases, especially when it's a negative one. And so they're already dealing with this whole like awful conception of themselves based on what the modern world gives them. And then on top of that, our communities are forcing, like pigeonholing an idea of sexuality that is nearly unattainable, especially for someone coming out of the Western experience. And in trying to navigate that, I really just spoiled the whole, show, at least in the first 2 years. And then trying to walk out of it, I didn't, I wasn't able to, so to speak. And so the relationship ended. And so that was a point of facing that, and admitting that was itself a kind of guilt and shame and and work to have to do, that admitting that I'd failed on both sides and not really met either.
Amazing.
Sure. I really I mean, yeah, Deva, I feel you very deeply. I feel you very deeply there, my friend, and I'm very grateful to you for really being able to say it as it is, in many ways. And like, yeah, I mean, two of you, Jai and Deva, both of you are aware, but I'm currently finding myself going through an extended, ongoing process of very deep deliberation as to, how I'm supposed to actually reconcile my sexuality with the external standards, the very, very rigid, compromising standards that are essentially being expected of me, that I am completely convinced I cannot live up to, at least for at least for as long as my youth goes, and that is really a hell of a thing. And I recently wrote an article, which I have not yet released, because basically I'm kind of like, I'm so cautious about, because this is the thing. Like, I have a certain honest experience, right? Now, that honest experience, if I were to express it publicly, would get me in a lot of trouble. And I have been told that in so many words, in exactly those words, because I wrote an article about the way that I really feel about this whole debacle. And I consulted with one of my seniors, a very, very advanced and very experienced devotee who has, especially dealt with this entire realm of subject matter very extensively. And he literally said to me, if you say that publicly, you will get your head chopped off. You will literally get yourself you'll get yourself kicked out of ISKCON. That's what he said to me. So now it's like, it's kind of like this deliberation of like, should I authentically express what I really think and what I really feel and what I really feel needs to happen? Or, do I just kind of like keep myself at bay, and to try to not publicly challenge the status quo or the way that things have been established, despite looking around me and seeing so much inauthenticity and so much shame and so much like struggle, so So it's really, really a very, very conflicted thing. Because just to kind of end off for now is that, like, unlike Jai and Deva, you guys basically came into this divine spiritual philosophy, and you were so relieved by finding out that essentially you're something much deeper than this, and that you don't have to identify with these desires of the body. But I had a great time being the body before I came to Krishna consciousness. I was having a hella great time, and, like, honestly, my sensual indulgences were really like the only experiences in life that was giving me, any sense of feeling like liberated and free, and truly like life has any sort of meaning. Obviously it wasn't enough, because here I am, Karuna Avatar Das, but still it was still a thing, so it's like now I'm having to reconcile all of these things anyway. Yeah.
Okay, Kishore, you want to go? Okay, you can go.
Should I go? Okay.
Yeah, you can go. I can go last. I don't mind.
Okay. No, I was just gonna say that. I was just gonna share, and I really like what. Thank you, David Madhava Prabhu, for just being so honest about what needs to happen. And Karuna Avatar, I feel you. I feel you for sure, because I was also having a great time. Well, I think honestly, I really connect a lot with the verses. There's a lot of verses in Bhagavatam that speak about suffering, and that speak about, like, kind of like enduring the suffering that we are supposed to have in our life, according to our material bodies, according to our past karma, and etc. And that endurance will simply, like, just make us better. It will give us that right to have access to Krishna. And I really always connect with those kinds of verses in the Bhagavatam, because for me, at least, it was always like I would have a lot of fun and a lot of pleasure and a lot of all that stuff until it got real bad real fast. And I always joke with Jaya about this, because at least, like, in the I don't know how, I think that women probably experience this a lot, where, like, things go really bad real fast, where it's like a guy seems nice and all of a sudden they slip the roofie in your drink, or like everything seems like
I'm not supposed to laugh about that. I'm laughing about it in the context of what Kishore's about to say, because
he knows he knows what I'm about to say. So I feel like maybe women experience this, that sense of, like, where male energy can get really predatory and really, like, evil and destructive if it goes uncontrolled. And so in the LGBT world, specifically the gay male world, it's like that energy is still present, and it's very present. And so and it's obviously, like, twofold, because now there's everyone's a man. And so I remember just, like, I remember having direct experiences where, like, things seem fun. And I always joke with Jaya about this, where it's just like, I don't know at what point, but, like, I really don't want to get to that point where it's just like I'm having a good time on the dance floor, and then all of a sudden I end up, like, in a sex dungeon, like, chained, like, being whipped. And it's like, but the thing is that, like, the saddest and that hasn't happened to me. And I really am praying that it doesn't happen to me. But I know people that has happened to. I know people that has happened to, and the sickest, and this, okay, I don't want to use the word sick because it might come off as judgmental, but the scariest thing is when I start to really, like, by I mean, like, the general I, when I start to really think, like, that's what I want, or that's what I need, or that's what makes me feel alive and free. I've gotten to that point in of identifying with my sexual, my sexuality, that I'm like, oh, only this, reaching this limit of that is going to make me feel free or alive, because that's why all these people who are doing these things, that's why they're doing it, like, I'm talking about, like, extreme sexual acts, right? Like, I don't know, dungeons, dominatrixes, whatever. Like people are doing it because they need to feel free. They need to feel alive again. They need to feel this sense of like whatever. And I had the, you know, the blessing and the mercy to like experience some darkness in my life, to be like, oh, this sensual pleasure stuff is like, I don't want to end up in that dungeon, you know, like I really truly don't want to end up in that dungeon. Like Jaya was my roommate in the ashram for many years, for those of you that don't know that. And I always used to joke with him and be like, Jaya, I really don't want you to get a call one day and be like, oh, so we found someone in the Hudson, and yeah, it seems like they had like chains on them and collars and all sorts of stuff. I really don't want to go down that route. And so for me, I also experienced, to get back onto the conversation of like joining the ashram and joining a spiritual path very seriously, I feel like it was very much a blessing for me to go through all of that dark stuff and to go through all of like the shame and guilt kind of first. Not saying that I didn't experience it also when joining, when joining the ashram and joining, but it made me very hyper aware of like what I was joining, and very like blatantly honest, to be frank. Like I remember in like the first kind of groups that I started coming to, I remember like writing an email to a Prabhu, just being like, this is my situation and I need to make sure that this is a safe space, because if it's not, then I don't want to come, you know? And so I had a lot of mercy in that sense, that like I had those life experiences first that led me to just be like, this is the situation, this is what's happening. And I had a lot of grace from those Prabhus that were just like, yeah, of course you're allowed to come, of course you should be here, of course this, of course that. And I think it also brought me to a point of honesty where when I was like deciding to take spiritual life more seriously and looking for, a guru and this kind of thing, I was very much encouraged to be very honest with my guru, just like be extremely honest, just tell him what's going on, tell him everything. And that has actually deepened my relationship with my guru, and having like instructions specifically around these kinds of things, which I feel like most people, I mean, at least it's my understanding that most people don't do that. Most people aren't like extremely honest with their guru, whether it be, gay or not gay, just about like, hey, this is where I'm at in regards to like the principles and in regards to following everything like to the T. Like, this is where I'm at. Like, what do I do? Because essentially that's what I told my guru, except, from a different perspective in the sense of being gay. Like, this is where I'm at. Because my experience was that I thought that I was pure before moving into the ashram. Like, I remember like the 2 years before I moved into the ashram, I was like, I just want to be a brahmachari and I just want to live in the ashram and I just want to be pure. I want to forget about all this like crazy gay, sex dungeon world. And then when I finally moved into the ashram, it was like all the desires just like, shoom, like a wave just came onto me. And I was like, oh, what did I do? And so I remember it became very clear to me that there needed to be some sort of middle ground. Like for me specifically, for me in my situation, there needed to be some sort of middle ground between like following all of the principles super strictly and just like super rigid. Because on top of that, I'll end here, from the perspective of like, just being a person in a gay body, it's like I also had to deal with like on a philosophical level of just like, wait a minute, does this mean like, does the principles mean like, the principles mean that like, because it's saying that we should only have sex for procreation, like I just like could never have sex ever again? Like, am I just supposed to be a eunuch for the rest of my life? And I always joked around with this with Jaya, because I was just like, I think that, for me, it was such a great fear of like being accepted, being accepted in the community, being accepted. And I always felt, thankfully, I always felt like I was in the community that I was in. But I always thought like, if I had a partner, like if I had, and I like walked into the temple with that partner, like, would that be okay? And I even like had to have sit down conversations, because it was just paining my mind. Like, is this okay? Like, if one day I have a partner and this, because
I remember one time you asked one devotee and they were like, yeah, it'll be okay. And then you asked me and another devotee and we were like, nah, homie, don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah, and I think like it's just like when things become very, and I guess I'm gonna try to like go away from like the gay angle, but just like when we stand in our honesty, when we stand in our honesty of just like, yeah, this is my situation with this person, whether they be a man or a woman or whatever, and it is what it is, you know, like this is where I'm at right now. And is that okay? As opposed to hiding behind, I like the word language that was being used, hiding behind like the principles or giving this facade that like, we're just like the perfect couple and the perfect devotee couple and the perfect devotee person. And I feel like that's, for me, has been such a point of like trying to maneuver how to do that. So I'm really interested to know, Karuna Avatar, maybe later, what it is, this thing that you've written, because I've always like tried to like understand how to maneuver that space of like standing in my authenticity and honesty and just being like, yeah, this is where I'm at right now, you know? Or, and then like seeing how people see me or how people want to see me or like how I'm supposed to be. And like those two things seem sometimes irreconcilable. Is that a word? I don't know. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I personally, on this subject matter, and I need to find my charger because my computer's about to die, but I experienced definitely a magnification of guilt and shame in the context of like the regular principles being very much emphasized in this con. I remember my very first class before I was even embracing devotion at a Sunday feast. And you know how when you're coming to the first time Sunday feast, you're hearing a class, and you don't know shit about shit. And so basically the only thing that sticks out to you in the class are keywords. So in the class, the speaker, I remember who it was. I'm not going to say who it was, but I specifically remember, this is almost 20 years ago, but I'll never forget this. In the class, he says, this is condemned. And these people, they are condemned. And that one, he is condemned. And I remember just experiencing the class as like, wow, these people condemn everyone just like the Christian. I'm out. I'm not coming back to this. Luckily, 3 days later, I found my first book, SSR, and I became a devotee right after reading that. So once I entered into the ashram, I really realized there was like a strong emphasis on the four regular principles as the bar of purity. And as Deva Madhava was saying, instead of the bar of purity being where is your love for Krishna, it really was centered around the four regular principles. And so I observed over the years that emphasis also augments shame, because a lot of people take those vows and then they can't follow them for literally obvious reasons. The obvious reason being, homie, you still in ignorance and you haven't even done a Narshana Vritti yet. Of course, you're going to be popping off a little bit every now and again. Anyway, sorry to be using such language. But so, and then having not been able to stick to the standard, you kind of just resign yourself to being, less than. You feel ashamed about it, basically. And I remember, so for me, because I have a philosophical mind, I think a lot about, and I'm really into the philosophy of Christian consciousness. I was observing that. I was observing the magnification of guilt and shame within my own self because of that sort of standard. But of course, I was following the standard. So I was like, I'm okay, until I got out of ashram. Then I was like, I'm not okay. All right, I need to work on this. I need to figure this out. I need to philosophize. Because, as you said, rightfully, I think, Deva, that men tend to deal with their emotions a little. We kind of abstract ourselves from the situation, which can make us a little bit stoic and so on. But I can see that this emphasis has really translated in an unhealthy way in the mind. I'm going to give a anecdote. Can I give an anecdote? This anecdote is funny. It's about initiation of one of our godbrothers. Give me 2 seconds. Chant Hare Krishna. My computer's about to die, and I really want to get through this anecdote before my computer dies.
We have a nice comment from Jeshal. He's saying, is the antidote to the pain of shame some level of acceptance? And I would say, based on our conversation, that feels how most of us have been able, been able to move above and beyond and out of whatever that dungeon of guilt was, here I am. And a problem shared is a problem solved in so many ways, and chant and be honest, and suddenly it's not such a big deal.
Yeah, I have something on that too, a little bit. Let's see, here we go. Anyway, here's the anecdote. So it's the initiation of one of my godbrothers who's at Bhakti Center. So he's reciting the four regular principles, and you know how the principles are, they're like scripted. So they're given to us, and we kind of just repeat the script. So homie deviated from the script. So at one point when he got to, he was like, okay, no meat eating, no gambling. And then he said, no alcohol. So we were like, oh, that's not exactly the principle. A little bit of a Freudian slip there. And then he shook it off and was like, I mean, no intoxication. So, the audience was kind of giggling a little bit, because that happens to all of us. We get nervous at initiation. But then after that, homeboy said, and no sex. And all the guys, we were like, no! Like we were cutting so many jokes about that in the back. We were like, at least when you say no illicit sex, you got a lot of wiggle room. Because what is that illicit? You get a little bit of wiggle room there. But you just said no sex, and we were like, no, stop the initiation. Stop, change it up. That cannot be your vow. Anyway, for me, seeing that, I'm joking about it now, just in jest. But it kind of occurred to me that there's a little bit that was, in a sense, a Freudian slip for how the philosophy gets translated to us. And the only thing I can make out of it over the years was that, our philosophy is Bhakti Vedanta. So there's and I hate to make this division, but there's the Bhakti part and there's the Vedanta part. And the emphasis are a little bit different. Vedanta, as we know, Vedanta really refers to the Upanishads. And there is a strong emphasis on renunciation, on the path of Gyan Marg, a strong emphasis on self-abnegation. In fact, when you go to the 11th canto of the Bhagavad Purana, chapter 20, the beginning part where Krishna's talking about the qualification for each of the paths, he specifically mentions the adhikara, or qualification for the Gyan Marg, is this sort of self-abnegation and total renunciation of the material world. That's kind of like the Vedanta part, because in Bhakti, there is a natural renunciation that comes from tasting the beauty of Krishna. But that's supposed to be renunciation that comes from tasting the beauty of Krishna, not as renunciation so you can taste the beauty of Krishna. And so the Vedanta part is really hammered on in our communities. Literally, even when you're hearing Krishna Leela, people will bring in a strong Vedanta angle because we feel guilty that we're only talking about Krishna's story. And there has to be some other angle in there that encourages us to be renounced from material things. I get that. I'm not even criticizing that. I understand that, because we are entangled in Maya. We should talk about Maya. By talking about Maya, we can get out of Maya. There's a verse like that in the 7th chapter of the 2nd canto. So I get that. But on the other side, you have the qualification for bhakti mentioned by Krishna in the Uddhava, is that it's primarily faith in the topics of Krishna. That's the main adhikar. And then he says, if you have that qualification, you're not too attached and you're not too detached from matters. Because if you're too attached, obviously you're not going to do bhakti. But if you're too detached, then you're not going to engage with the energies around you in a healthy way for your service to and devotion to Krishna. So the devotee should not be too detached also. And I feel like what happens, and this is me thinking out loud and philosophizing about it a little bit. I feel like what happens is because we have such a strong emphasis on self-abnegation, that it paradoxically makes us preoccupied with the body and sex and sexuality. And I think George Forrestein also brings this up in his book, that we do become paradoxically preoccupied with the body because of that. Just like when we were brahmacharis, when we joined the brahmachari ashram, we were like, ew, women, which means that you were thinking about them all the time. That's just how that aversion is the flip side of attachment. So in our preoccupation with Vedanta, the bhakti part kind of gets eclipsed, and we paradoxically become preoccupied with the body. And as such, it really tends to indicate that we don't have a healthy relationship with our bodies, with our sex and sexuality. Therefore, we're preoccupied with it, because if we had a healthy relationship with it, it wouldn't really come up in the psyche so much. And then you would have all that extra room to just focus on how you're going to develop your bhakti. But all that room that could be used for that gets hijacked by this preoccupation with sex and sexuality, because we don't have a healthy relationship with it. So my question to you, I've kind of slid into another point, is that how do we navigate this paradox? On the one hand, the self-abnegation emphasis of Vedanta moving us back, causing us to be preoccupied with the body, and therefore betraying really an unhealthy relationship with the body. and with sexuality. Like, what would be, if you had to offer a suggestion to the community, what would be your suggestion for how to deal with this paradox?
I can.
Is my question clear? Is it a clear question? Okay, cool.
For sure. It's a great point. Vaishya Shekhar Prabhu says where attention goes, energy flows. And it doesn't matter if that attention is positive or negative. And so all this negative attention on the body just brings us into the bodily consciousness, this overcompensation. Sometimes I see it as little dog syndrome, you know, the little dogs that bark so much because they're so tiny. And so the guy is so focused on his renunciation, or the girl or whatever, of their physical circumstance, they have so little attention for Krishna, actually. My advice, what I've done personally, the last 3 or 4 years, seeing that I'm a little established in my Krishna consciousness. I have some understanding philosophically. I have some experience. I have some good and bads. I've now kind of revisited, what does my body need? And body means not only physical, but also mental and emotional. What does my physical, mental, and emotional body need to be kind of pacified to a degree where, with the rest of my energy and capacity, I'm able to think about Krishna and do some service for the devotees. And taking that reassessment after being around a few years and dealing with my own misconceptions and other people's misconceptions and the unhealthy nature of the society in general, I've really come into a settled place personally where I know this is what I need, and I don't care if you don't know that. I don't need you to know that. I know, and the people who really matter in my life, they can also see it, and they're appreciating it. And from that experience and that affirmation from those people that I know I can trust, not somebody on Dundavats or somebody on Facebook or whatever, some guy that on Sunday and gives the feast talk, I know that I don't necessarily have to trust that person. I can respect them, but I don't have to give a sense of myself to that person and their assessment of what my Krishna consciousness is supposed to be. And so in making that honest reassessment for myself, I found a lot of peace and fulfillment.
Wow, nice. Really powerful.
So
any other suggestions? If you had to give a suggestion to the community in navigating this paradox and coming out of it successfully.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this as everyone was speaking, and I think that a really, really big factor that plays into this entire equation is the need for validation, the need to feel accepted and that you belong. And so, you know, we find ourselves in an institution that has certain very rigid requirements for what a virtuous life is supposed to look like. And I think that especially in an immature phase of one's development, having not come to understand that perhaps, you know, imbibing the ideal standard of life is a point that you can work towards, and something that, you know, you can ultimately achieve in time as you mature. I feel like everyone in their early phases is expecting themselves to become a saint from the get-go, but we need to become true human beings before we can become saints, I feel. And we need to actually understand, exactly as Deva Madhava said, you know, on an individual level, what is it that our body minds require in order to be sufficiently nourished and satisfied and well situated, so that we are able to direct our consciousness towards the ultimate goal of prema bhakti. Because now also, just taking it a little bit further, it's kind of like there is a certain public standard of what things are supposed to be like for every person, and Srila Prabhupada has established that very, very strongly. Now, and also even in terms of our scriptures, there is no question of because also that is a Western tendency, as Hari Vilas likes to point out, that we in the West have a tendency that, you know, if something doesn't suit our desires, then we want to change the standard. Now, you can't change ultimate truth. Truth is truth, and you can't change it. Like, we can't expect to challenge that, you know, that anything below sex only for procreation, you know, can actually be defined as licit sex. We can't expect that. So basically what it essentially comes down to is that every person has to come to the point of accepting that in their own personal private life, they have to very consciously discern what it is they need, as Deva Madhava has done, you know, in order to be able to reach the ultimate standard, and to not expect to be validated by everyone around you in the entire society. Because ultimately, the entire society is not relevant to us. What is relevant to us is our communities.
Right.
You know?
Yes. Right.
The people that surround us, those who are closest to us, those that actually play an active role in our lives. And that is exactly what Deva Madhava has also said, that, you know, when those people can clearly see that you're at a certain point and that you require a certain thing in order to progress, you know, maybe you need to take a step back in order to take a few steps forward, then that's great. That's all you need, you know.
Nice.
Thank you. Kishore, you got any message for the community?
Yeah,
If you had,
just to kind of drive the point home, because I feel like Deva Madhava Prabhu said it so nicely. I agree with everything that he said. But one thing that, since we have been talking about shame a lot, shame kind of being like the extreme version of like where guilt eventually manifests, I feel like shame really like breeds and multiplies in secrecy, you know? And it's like when I'm trying to keep it a secret that I feel this way, or that I have these quote unquote bad feelings, or etc., then it really just kind of like permeates your entire being, and it leads you to do things that are unspeakable, or things that you didn't think that you would do, and it's because you're suffering, you know, it's because you're suffering. So I think something that has really helped me personally, and I think that this is kind of just like it's kind of like a no-brainer, but at the same time, we and by we I mean all of us, we tolerate situations sometimes, or we tolerate just being in situations that aren't necessarily conducive to our flourishing in so many different ways. But I guess what I wanted to say is just like, find your people, you know, like find your people that you feel comfortable with, that you feel like you can speak to very honestly about the challenges that you're going through. Because I really like what Karuna Avatar said. It's like, you're not going to speak openly about your personal private challenges with the entire organization of ISKCON, you know, like that's not what we're doing here. So it's like, you really need to find your group, your niche. Yeah, that's what we are doing. You really need to find your group and your niche of people that you feel like you can really trust, that you feel like you can really speak openly about these kinds of things. Because I feel like that's when real growth happens. I feel like that's where, you know, real progress starts to happen, where I can, you know, someone made this beautiful comment of like acceptance. It's like, yeah, that's like the first step. It's like, I accept that these are things that are going on in my life. And now I have friends and Sangha around me that are supporting me through the process of, you know, arising from that, you know? Because I think that to be kind of, I know Jaya always is using this language about becoming like the hero of your own story. It's like, you have to go through the demons. You have to go through the dark night of the soul. And it's like, you need help doing that. You know, you need help. You need a lot of help doing that. So yeah, that would be my message. Just like, find your people, make sure you vibe with them, make sure you can be honest with them. And you know, just to put a cherry on top of that, if you're in a situation where you feel like you're not around your people, and you're like pretending and you're putting on facades to like be the version that like this group that you're around is saying that you're supposed to be, then get out of there, you know, get out of there, go find your people, go for it.
Beautiful message. I really don't feel like you guys left anything for me. It's okay, I'm not envious, but just recapitulating what I thought that I heard, just the basic ideas as food for thought for the community is find out what you need on a psychological level, on a physiological level. I would even go as far as say on an identity level, like finding you need your identity by which you relate to the world and you feel that you're giving value to the world. So you have to discover that. It's likely you'll discover that in the context of a community of people that care about you. But then that's the other point, find your people. That's like a very critical point. The other one being stop seeking validation from the whole institution. I would even say stop seeking validation from the impersonal standards that are intended for the institution that we kind of tend to impose upon ourselves without taking guidance, without seeking like specific help, like how I can come to that standard, how I can gradually move from where I'm at now to being the saint that I want to be or to be the hero. Stop just looking at the standards impersonally, but actually find out proper guidance. And so I think that's the part that I want to emphasize is the guidance part. You know, Srila Sridhar Maharaj, Prabhupada's godbrother, he says that Shastra is the passive agent of divinity. And the guru, the guide, is the active agent of divinity. So the passive agent of divinity isn't going to check up on you. So it's not going to see if you're applying properly or if you're doing well. And so a lot of us there is an emphasis like this also, which may or may not be healthy, but just read the books as if it's divorced from actually getting proper guidance. And so you can try that, but it is a passive agent of divinity. So if there is a misapplication, you're going to go down and you're going to suffer the consequences of that. So there's going to be need for the active agent of divinity in your life, the proper guide to help you apply standards at the level which you're at and which you can move. And I think what I want to contribute to this point is that as far as the guide, those who will be guiding others are concerned. So there's a lot from that side, but I want to speak from the side of those who are giving guidance or giving friendship or giving counsel or giving you somehow some elder or whatever it is, some respected member of the community. I think it's really important for those who give guidance to have a clarity about the philosophy. I always like to make that point, but particularly in the context of this conversation, seeing the distinction between Bhakti and Vedanta, and how although someone may fail in terms of a strictly Vedantic consideration, they can still prosper when they're connected to Bhakti. Not only they can, but they will in fact prosper the more they're able to embrace that devotion and increase the embrace of that devotion in their life. So when someone's coming to you with this shame, with this guilt, I personally do this for my own self, and I definitely have done it for a lot of guys who have confided in me, is I downplay the problem that they're talking about. I don't really put that much emphasis on it. I remember walking with a friend one time. We were coming from, I don't know if I should say this because it's going to put me out there, but we were coming from Peace Food Cafe, a vegan cafe, which is another problem, devotees eating outside. That's a whole nother podcast. Anyway, we were leaving the restaurant. He was asking like in angst almost, like, this is my problem. Like, how would you deal with this problem? So I looked at him like very seriously, just for dramatic effect. And I said, I would be like, man, this is what I told him. I was like, man, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, well. And then I started like skipping down the street, you know, like a high school girl. I just started skipping down the street. And he and I had a very good laugh in the street. We were laughing so hard for like 5 minutes. And I said, bro, that's literally how I process my own personal conditioning. I realized that the imposition of Maya is strong, and I do have to do a lot more of my bhakti if I want to remove that imposition. But my focus is going to be doing a lot more for my bhakti and not in my failures as a conditioned soul. And so I think as a guide or as a friend or that people confide in, that sort of emphasis should really be there. Not only by doing that do you make yourself trustworthy as someone who can hold space for the more embarrassing parts of our humanity, which people are always looking for someone who can do that for them. But you also direct them in the proper way toward the embrace of their ideal so that they get more and more encouragement to just hang on to that and gradually in their own way grow towards the ideal that they seek. So I think that would be the other element that I would add to that. These beautiful points that you all brought up. It's 1.5 hours. Yeah, Dave, you want to say something?
I just want to point out, I love how you brought that all together, and it just really drives home that this focus on the renunciation and our failings, it's just this trapdoor back to the same problem of the false ego, wanting to focus on self, right? Like this is a Shastric way in which I can still focus on me instead of Krishna. All my sufferings, all my problems, all my failings, all my shortcomings, but the real juice here is that it's me and not Krishna and the devotees.
Right. What a wonderful way of putting that. Nice. Well, if there are any final comments, I think we'll stop here. This was a fantastic conversation, guys. Like, I personally had such a good time. I'm just like, I'm about to burst out into laughter. I'm having such a good time with this conversation. I just wanted to give a shout out for those of you who don't already know that this podcast is called Arise, the Honest Man's Podcast. It's a podcast. It's like a show on the channel that is Bodhika. So Bodhika is a new up-and-coming community for creatives to kind of share their testimony or their witness to the power of bhakti in their own personal lives. We're looking for more and more creatives who can do that and add to this burgeoning devotional online community that we can send people to give a sense of how this bhakti can actually impact you on a personal level. The inspiration behind this group is Dave Madhava himself, so we're really happy to have you here. We're going to probably have you on a lot more for obvious reasons.
The inspiration is actually you, Prabhus, because you inspired me that we need a platform like this to showcase the honest and genuine experience of bhakti that so many are having outside of the kind of institutional stereotyped ideas. So thank you for accepting my invitation, but you're the inspiration.
Spoken like a true humble devotee. All right, we'll finish here unless there's any final comments anyone wants to make. Hey guys, I also want to say that we have saved your questions. They are going to be episodes in the future that we would like to get to, but we really wanted to paint more of a landscape of the inner world of what I think all people are going through, but specifically men go through when dealing with sex and sexuality. We tend to get overlooked, except for when we're being toxic. So we want to bring out, like, there's reasons why we get toxic or we are toxic. And if you can get a sense of that landscape, we might have a better way of attacking the problem at the root and coming up with more substantial solutions. So thank you all very much for participating. Is there any final statements, David? You look like you wanted to say something.
I was just going to suggest you put up your Satsanga link in the comments, because I got a bunch of messages last time, people wanting to get connected with that.
I'll do that right now. All right. Kruna Avatar, you want to say anything while I'm pulling this up, or Kishore Chandra? Just final statements. Keep them short.
Well, nah, I feel like we've yeah, I just knocked over my flask. I'm just like, practically in ecstasy. No, I just want to express that I'm utterly existentially satisfied right now, and I'm very, very grateful to have been able to converse with you, Prabhus, in this way, and that we're hopefully able to open up necessary conversations that can, just help other people. We hope to uplift, essentially. It is called Arise. So just thank you, everyone, for tuning in and being with us.
Yes. Bhishma, if you don't mind, I can't actually comment in the public thing. So I sent the link for the Instagram in the private chat. Maybe you can just add it to the public thing. This Arise podcast is part of the initiative of Satsanga, Sexual Sobriety and Transmutation Sangha. It's an accountability brotherhood for helping men show up to the life as the man that they can admire. That is the purpose of the particular group. We have an Instagram right now. We'll probably start a Facebook soon. And the Instagram link is there in the public chat now. You can click it. DM us if you're male. And we'll get back to you for how you can join the group and participate. Thank y'all so much. Wonderful podcast. Thank you very much. Hari Om Tat Sat. See you later, family. See you in the next.